December 16, 1985. Christmas shoppers fill the sidewalks of Manhattan's East 46th Street. Holiday music drifts from store windows as expensive cars drop off well-dressed diners outside Sparks Steakhouse. Just another Monday evening in one of New York's most upscale neighborhoods. At exactly 5:26 p.m., a black Lincoln Town car pulls up to the restaurant. Paul Castellano, the 70-year-old boss of the Gambino crime family, steps out of the passenger side. His driver and underboss, Thomas Bellotti, walks around the front of the car. Both men are wearing expensive overcoats against the December cold. Quick question before we dive in. Drop a comment and let me know what city you're watching from.
4 men in white trench coats and black Russian fur hats appear from nowhere. 6 gunshots crack through the evening air. Castellano hits the pavement first, blood pooling beneath his gray hair. Bellotti tries to run but gets hit 4 times before he can take 3 steps. In less than 30 seconds, the most powerful mafia boss in America is dead on a Manhattan sidewalk. But this hit didn't happen overnight. The man who ordered it had been planning Paul Castellano's murder for 2 years. His name was John Gotti, and this assassination would make him the most famous mobster in American history. It would also set in motion the events that would eventually destroy him.
This is Accused, where we break down the cases that defined crime in America. If you're new here, hit subscribe. We drop deep dives like this every week. This is the story that turned the American Mafia into a media circus. For the first time, we have access to the FBI surveillance tapes they didn't want you to hear, the witness testimony that brought down an empire, and the recordings that captured every detail of how John Gotti became America's most notorious crime boss.
This case shook law enforcement to its core because it proved something terrifying, that organized crime in America had evolved far beyond what anyone imagined. We're talking about a criminal empire worth over $500 million a year, with tentacles reaching into construction, gambling, and murder for hire. But more than that, this is the story of how John Gotti's own ego became his greatest enemy. This is the story of how a Queen Street kid became the Teflon Don, and how the FBI finally made the charges stick. John Joseph Gotti was born in the South Bronx on October 27, 1940. He was the 5th child out of 13 kids born to Italian immigrant parents, John and Fanny Gotti. His father worked as a day laborer when he could find work, which wasn't often. The family moved constantly, always one step ahead of unpaid rent. By the time John was 12, the Gottis had settled in East New York, Brooklyn, one of the roughest neighborhoods in the city. This was where young Gotti got his real education. While other kids were in school, John was running errands for local mobsters, earning pocket change, and learning how the streets really worked. The FBI files from this period describe him as charismatic but dangerously violent. At 14, he was arrested for the first time. By 16, he'd dropped out of Franklin K. Lane High School and formed his own gang, the Fulton Rockaway Boys. This wasn't just any teenage gang. These kids were already stealing cars, robbing trucks, and building connections with the Gambino crime family. But it was one meeting that changed everything for John Gotti. In 1957, while running numbers for a local bookie, he met Agnello Della Croce, a rising star in the Gambino family who would become his lifelong mentor. Della Croce saw something special in the young street kid from Queens. He saw ambition, intelligence, and most importantly, he saw someone who would do whatever it took to climb the ladder. By 1968, Gotti was no longer small-time. He was part of a crew hijacking trucks at Kennedy Airport, making more money in a week than his father made in a year. But with success came attention from the FBI, and in 1968, John Gotti got his first real taste of prison. He was sentenced to 3 years for hijacking. When he got out in 1971, he was ready to become a made man.
1973 was the year John Gotti killed for the first time. Jimmy McBratney, a rival gang member, had kidnapped and murdered a Gambino family member. The order came down from the top. McBratney had to die. Gotti volunteered for the job. On May 22, 1973, Gotti walked into Snoop's Bar and Grill in Staten Island and shot McBratney 3 times. The problem was, Gotti was far from discreet. Multiple witnesses saw his face. He was arrested in 1974 and later pleaded guilty to attempted manslaughter. But even while serving his 4-year sentence, Gotti was building his reputation. Prison officials were taking bribes to let him visit his family and associates. He was already learning how to buy his way out of trouble. When Gotti was released in 1977, Carlo Gambino was dead, and Paul Castellano had taken over as boss. This created a split in the family. Castellano represented the old school. He wanted to move away from street crime and into legitimate businesses. But Agnello Della Croce, now the family's underboss, represented the street crews who made their money the traditional way, through hijacking, gambling, and muscle. Gotti was promoted to captain of the Bergen crew, operating out of a social club in Queens. His territory included Kennedy Airport, which was a gold mine for hijacking operations. Between 1977 and 1985, FBI surveillance estimated that Gotti's crew was stealing millions of dollars worth of cargo every year. But by 1983, things started falling apart. The FBI had been building a massive case against the Gambino family, using wiretaps and informants to document every crime. In August 1983, Angelo Ruggiero, one of Gotti's closest friends, was arrested for heroin trafficking. The wiretaps from Ruggiero's house contained hours of incriminating conversations, including discussions about drug dealing that directly violated Castellano's orders. Paul Castellano demanded that Della Croce turn over the tapes so he could see exactly who in his family was defying him, but Della Croce refused, protecting Gotti and his crew. The tension between Castellano and Della Croce's faction was reaching a breaking point. Everyone in the family knew that something had to give. On December 2, 1985, Agnello Della Croce died of cancer. 2 weeks later, Paul Castellano would be dead too, and John Gotti would be the new boss of the most powerful crime family in America. December 16, 1985, 5:15 p.m. John Gotti and Sammy Gravano sit in a Lincoln sedan parked on East 46th Street, directly across from Sparks Steakhouse. Both men have walkie-talkies. They're waiting for Paul Castellano to arrive for what he thinks is a peace meeting with other family members. Frank DeCicco, a Gambino captain who's secretly working with Gotti, has set up the meeting. Castellano thinks he's coming to smooth things over after missing Della Croce's funeral. He has no idea he's walking into an execution. At 5:20, 4 shooters take their positions near the restaurant entrance. They're dressed identically in white trench coats and black Russian fur hats, a deliberate choice to draw attention to their clothing, not their faces. The hit team includes Salvatore Scala, Edward Lino, and John Carneglia, all experienced killers. 5:26 p.m. Castellano's black Lincoln pulls up to the restaurant. Thomas Bilotti is driving. Gotti gives the signal over the walkie-talkie. They're here. Castellano steps out of the passenger side, adjusting his overcoat. He's completely unaware of what's about to happen. The 4 shooters move in fast. The first gunman reaches Castellano just as he starts walking toward the restaurant entrance. 6 shots to the head and chest. Castellano drops instantly, his expensive suit soaking up blood on the Manhattan sidewalk. Bilotti, hearing the gunshots, tries to look through the driver's side window to see what's happening to his boss. He doesn't realize that 2 other shooters are already moving toward him. When he finally gets out of the car, it's too late. 4 shots drop the newly appointed underboss before he can take 3 steps. The entire hit lasts less than 90 seconds. The shooters run east toward 2nd Avenue, disappearing into the crowd of Christmas shoppers and rush-hour commuters. Panic spreads as pedestrians realize what they've just witnessed. From across the street, Gotti calmly drives past the scene. According to Sammy Gravano's later testimony, Gotti wanted to make sure both men were dead. As they pass the bodies, Gravano tells Gotti he's gone. The most powerful mob boss in New York has just been assassinated in broad daylight in the middle of Manhattan, and John Gotti is already the new king. Question for you. You're second in command in a crime family. Your boss is about to have you killed for something you did. Do you A. try to disappear and start over somewhere else, B. try to negotiate and make peace, or C. kill him first and take over the family? John Gotti chose option C, but as we'll see, becoming the boss made him a target for something much more dangerous than rival mobsters: the full attention of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Within days of Castellano's murder, John Gotti was officially recognized as the new boss of the Gambino family. But unlike every previous Mafia boss in New York, Gotti craved the spotlight. He wore $2,000 suits, got his hair cut every day, and actually talked to reporters on the street. The media ate it up, dubbing him the Dapper Don. The FBI's New York office, led by Bruce Mau and the Gambino squad, had been building cases against organized crime for decades. But Gotti presented a unique challenge. He was careful, he was smart, and most importantly, he had the loyalty of his entire crew. In 1986, Gotti faced his first major trial on racketeering charges. The case seemed solid. The FBI had recordings, witness testimony, and documented evidence of multiple crimes. But when the jury returned their verdict, Gotti walked free. Not guilty on all counts. 1987 brought another trial, this time for assault and conspiracy. Again, the evidence seemed overwhelming. Again, Gotti beat the charges. The media started calling him the Teflon Don because nothing seemed to stick. What the public didn't know was how these acquittals were happening. FBI surveillance later revealed that Gotti's crew was systematically intimidating witnesses and tampering with juries. In the 1987 trial, one of the jurors was actually receiving regular payments from the Gambino family. Another juror was being threatened through family members. By 1990, Gotti had beaten 3 major federal cases. He was untouchable, and he knew it. He started taking even bigger risks, talking openly about family business in places where he knew the FBI might be listening. His ego had grown to match his reputation. But the FBI wasn't giving up. Bruce Mau's team had spent years learning how the Gambino family operated. They knew Gotti's daily routines, his favorite meeting places, and most importantly, they knew where he felt safe enough to speak freely. The Ravenite Social Club at 247 Mulberry Street in Little Italy became Gotti's unofficial headquarters. Every Tuesday and Thursday night, Gotti would hold court with his captains and soldiers. The FBI rented an apartment directly across the street and began 24-hour surveillance. But getting close enough to record conversations inside the club was nearly impossible. The building was old, the walls were thick, and Gotti's security was always watching for bugs. It took the FBI months of planning to figure out how to get listening devices inside the building, where Gotti felt comfortable enough to discuss murder, racketeering, and the daily operations of his criminal empire. By 1989, the FBI had successfully planted listening devices in several locations around the Ravenite Social Club. They had bugs in the main club area, in a hallway, and most importantly, in an apartment upstairs, where Gotti would go for private conversations with his underboss, Sammy Gravano. The recordings from this period would later become the most damaging evidence against John Gotti. On tape after tape, Gotti could be heard openly discussing murders he had ordered, including the killings of Paul Castellano, Robert DiBernardo, and Liborio Milito. He talked about the family's business interests, their control over construction unions, and their systematic use of violence to solve business disputes. But as the FBI listened to hundreds of hours of recordings, they started noticing something else. John Gotti was becoming increasingly critical of Sammy Gravano, his most trusted lieutenant. In a conversation recorded on December 12, 1989, Gotti complained to Frank Locascio about Gravano's business dealings, saying, "Every time I turn around, there's a new company popping up, and every time we get a partner who don't agree with us, we kill him." What Gotti didn't realize was that Gravano could sense the shift in their relationship. Gravano had been Gotti's underboss for nearly 4 years, but he was starting to feel like Gotti was setting him up to take the fall for the family's crimes. The FBI recordings captured Gotti discussing plans to deal with Gravano if he continued to cause problems. Sammy Gravano had spent his entire adult life in the Gambino family. He'd killed 19 people for the organization, including his own best friend and his brother-in-law, but by 1990 he was starting to realize that loyalty in the Mafia only flowed one direction. Meanwhile, the FBI was building the strongest RICO case in the history of organized crime prosecutions. They had over 100 hours of recordings of John Gotti discussing specific crimes. They had surveillance footage of meetings between family members, and they had financial records showing millions of dollars in illegal income. On December 11, 1990, FBI agents and New York police detectives surrounded the Ravenite Social Club. John Gotti, Sammy Gravano, and Frank LoCascio were arrested on charges that included murder, racketeering, extortion, jury tampering, and conspiracy. For the first time in his criminal career, John Gotti was denied bail. As the three men sat in federal custody awaiting trial, none of them could have predicted what would happen next. The FBI had spent years building their case around recordings and surveillance, but they were about to get something even more powerful, a witness from inside John Gotti's inner circle who was ready to tell the world exactly how the Gambino family really operated. While John Gotti, Sammy Gravano, and Frank LoCascio were in federal custody preparing for trial, the FBI made a decision that would change everything. They played some of the Ravenite recordings for Sammy Gravano, specifically the conversations where John Gotti was complaining about him and suggesting he might need to be eliminated. For Gravano, hearing those tapes was a betrayal that cut deeper than anything he'd experienced in 30 years of organized crime. This was the man he'd helped become boss. This was the man he'd committed murder for. And now John Gotti was preparing to throw him under the bus to save himself. On November 13, 1991, Salvatore Gravano formally agreed to cooperate with the FBI. He was the highest-ranking member of the Gambino family ever to flip, and the second underboss in Mafia history to become a government witness. The decision sent shockwaves through organized crime families across the country. Gravano's debriefing sessions with the FBI lasted for months. He confessed to 19 murders, provided details about the Gambino family's criminal operations going back 2 decades, and most importantly, he gave prosecutors an inside account of how Paul Castellano's murder was planned and executed. According to Gravano's testimony, he had personally sat in the car with John Gotti on December 16, 1985, watching the Castellano assassination unfold. He described how they communicated with the hit team using walkie-talkies, how Gotti gave the final signal to proceed, and how they drove slowly past the bodies to make sure both men were dead. But Gravano's cooperation went far beyond the Castellano murder. He described in detail how the Gambino family controlled construction unions in New York, how they laundered money through legitimate businesses, and how they used violence and intimidation to maintain their power. His testimony would eventually lead to convictions of dozens of other mobsters across multiple crime families. The trial of John Gotti and Frank LoCascio began on January 20, 1992, in federal court in Brooklyn. For the first time in the history of organized crime prosecutions, the judge ordered that the jury remain completely anonymous and be sequestered throughout the trial. The government was taking no chances with jury tampering. On March 2, 1992, Sammy Gravano took the witness stand. For 9 days, he methodically described his life in the Gambino family, the crimes he had committed, and the role John Gotti played in ordering murders and running the criminal organization. He confirmed that Gotti had personally ordered the murders of Paul Castellano, Robert DiBernardo, and Liborio Melito. During cross-examination, Gotti's attorney Albert Krieger tried to portray Gravano as a mad dog killer who was lying to save himself. But Gravano remained calm and consistent throughout his testimony, corroborating his statements with specific details that matched the FBI's surveillance and recordings. On April 2, 1992, after just 14 hours of deliberation, the jury found John Gotti guilty on all 13 counts, including 5 murders, racketeering, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and tax evasion. Frank LoCascio was also convicted on all but one count. FBI Assistant Director James Fox held a press conference that afternoon, standing behind a podium with a massive organizational chart of the Gambino family. He made the announcement that law enforcement had been waiting years to deliver. The Teflon is gone. The Don is covered with Velcro, and every charge stuck. On June 23, 1992, Judge I. Leo Glasser sentenced both John Gotti and Frank LoCascio to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus a $250,000 fine. Before the sentence was read, Gotti addressed the court, maintaining his innocence and claiming he was the victim of a government conspiracy. John Gotti was transferred to the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, the highest security federal prison in the country. He was placed in solitary confinement, allowed out of his cell for only 1 hour each day. The man who had once controlled a $500 million criminal empire was now living in a concrete box measuring 6 feet by 8 feet. Prison officials made sure that Gotti had minimal contact with the outside world. His mail was monitored, his phone calls were recorded, and his visitors were strictly limited. The FBI was determined that John Gotti would never again be able to run the Gambino family from behind bars. In 1998, Gotti was diagnosed with throat cancer. His condition deteriorated rapidly, and he was transferred to the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri, for treatment. Even as his health failed, Gotti refused multiple offers from prosecutors to cooperate in exchange for better medical care. On June 10, 2002, John Joseph Gotti died at the age of 61. He had spent his last 10 years in federal custody, never again seeing the streets of Queens where he had built his criminal empire. To the very end, he maintained the code of silence that had defined his life in organized crime. Today, the Ravenite Social Club at 247 Mulberry Street is closed. The windows are boarded up, and there's nothing to indicate that it was once the headquarters of the most powerful crime boss in American history. But if you know where to look, you can still see the apartment windows across the street where FBI agents spent months recording every word John Gotti spoke. The final casualty count from John Gotti's rise and fall is staggering. Paul Castellano, Thomas Bellotti, Robert DiBernardo, Liborio Milito, Louis De Bono, these are just the murders that were proven in court. FBI estimates suggest that the Gambino family under Gotti's leadership was responsible for dozens of other killings that were never prosecuted. But perhaps the most important question isn't how many people died, but what John Gotti's story tells us about power, loyalty, and the American criminal justice system. Here was a man who controlled hundreds of millions of dollars, who commanded the loyalty of hundreds of people, who seemed untouchable for over a decade. And it all came crashing down because of his own ego and his inability to trust the people closest to him. The FBI's investigation of John Gotti didn't just bring down one criminal. Sammy Gravano's cooperation led to 37 convictions and fundamentally changed how organized crime operates in America. The old code of silence that had protected the Mafia for generations was broken, and it has never fully recovered. Tomorrow, we're covering another case where the FBI's patient investigation work paid off in a massive way. If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe. We've got 50 more deep dives coming that will show you exactly how the most notorious criminals in American history were finally brought to justice. John Gotti wanted to be remembered as the last great Mafia boss. In the end, he got his wish, but probably not in the way he intended. The Teflon wore off, but the legend never will.